Anything you would like to discuss today, you are most welcome to suggest our topic. Yes, beloved.
Why the spiritual approach to living and a focus on becoming more spiritually powerful is the only way in which black people can be healed, as opposed to all the other types of ways that we have tried to bring about a better condition for ourselves over the last few hundred years, economics, so on and so forth, and why those things have failed, and why the spiritual approach is the only thing that can do that.
Of course, that topic was thoroughly addressed in the Sankofa Dhamma, and for those who have not had the opportunity to familiarize themselves with my arguments, they can do so. I, however, will briefly respond to it, because
There's a lot to be said about that whole topic, isn't it, beloved? First thing we have to understand that the spiritual way of life and living and all of the disciplines associated with it are not simply necessary for black people. It is simply necessary for any person of any color, race, in order for them to become spiritually transformed. Sadhana as it pertains to people of African descent here in America, have to add some additional things to address all of the damage done to the African psyche as a result of the Ma'afa and all of that ordeal. Thus, it becomes impossible for any African person to really enter into the pure spiritual life without first dealing with their own personal damage that is a legacy of our sojourn here in America, as well as throughout diaspora, where slavery and the Ma'afa had the same kind of devastating impact on Africans in those parts of the world. One simply must deal with all of that. You see, beloved? Now, in the Sankofa Dhamma, we have begun to address the very specific aspects of that, haven't we? One of the things that shows up is, as a race, our inability to cooperate with one another. Well, that's fundamentally because on the individual level, we are in a state of disunity. We cannot even cooperate with ourselves. So this kind of restoring of ma'at, as we have called it, becomes essential for any black person that is serious about fully potentializing themselves from a spiritual point of view. That involves a lot of things. Things as simple as the abandonment of drugs. Things as simple as getting a job. Things as simple as becoming first a functional human being. We simply must get straight. What the ancestors have called true in speech, word, and deed. Makeru. You must simply get straight. And you must get straight in terms of all of the deficits that you have inherited, simply by virtue of your being black and being in this culture. Be whatever may be the causes for your dysfunctionality, you simply have to deal with that. There is no such thing as a dysfunctional person ever becoming enlightened. That never happens, period. For any race. And black people will not be an exception. The path to self and God realization takes what it takes. And it takes that irrespective of the circumstances you are coming out of and you're coming to the path. You see, beloved? So we have to identify those particular deficits, or as the African that created the Trika tradition called them malas. And Bamani and Samadhi in Prambani will be doing their workshop sometime this month, I believe on the 21st. Is it the 21st? Acha. And they will talk a little bit more about that concept of malas. But certainly they are covers of ignorance that prevents the usual person, and especially the African person, of really having a glimpse of who they are. Acha, beloved, the spiritual journey begins when one has had a glimpse of who one really is. That is a prerequisite. Contrary to popular belief, many approach the path thinking that by going through a process, they will finally come into the knowledge of who they are. It's just the opposite. You must first have a taste of that, an insight into that, an intuitive glimpse of it, before you can even transact the sadhana and disciplines associated with the path. Are you following me? You simply must know thyself. The ancient African Kemetic sages and mystics would always make it known to all those who would come to their temples or ashrams in search of the Chetuatnata, the hidden mysteries of God. They would always make them understand that first, know thyself. You may worship the gods if you please, but first you must know thyself. Because unless you know thyself, then there is no basis for the great work. in the great process to begin from. Now, the unique situation that people of African descent are confronted with in this culture is that by virtue of the Ma'afa, you have absolutely no concept of who you are, period. You have been totally, even at the socio-cultural level, de-Africanized. So the re-Africanization of the person of African descent is a necessary step, because you are simply taking on the identification that has been created for you by the architects of white supremacy. What we have called the nigger persona, the Negro persona. And you are fundamentally identified with that. Well, that has been manufactured. And if all you know about yourself is what you have been taught via these institutions in this society, you are definitely fundamentally ignorant of self. You are truly ignorant of yourself. You need to know who or whose you are. And this becomes the first step. So for black people then, you see, we have that extra added challenge, don't we? You must first recover your identity from the morass and all of the confusion that has resulted from the Ma'afa and its effect. So you must simply recover your identity at the social cultural level before you can even begin the journey into higher recoveries of your sense of self. Are you following me? And of course, the most ultimate recovery of one's sense of self is, again, according to the African wisdom tradition that we have called Trikachavaism. That recovery of your most ultimate identity, the pratyabhijana, is the recovery of yourself as God. And if you have studied even a little bit of the Cheta'anata, the wisdom tradition that informed the sinners in ancient Kemet, then you know that that stage was the goal and aim of those mystics and sages. It was to arrive at that point of recovery of one's true identity, whereby one could make the statement, anukasara, or anupanater, I am God. So there's much work to get from I am a nigger to anupanater. So much more can be said about it, beloved, but we will defer any further inquiries to the Sankofa Dhamma. Anything else you would like to discuss? You're most welcome. Yes, beloved?
Master, after having achieved a certain degree of self-consciousness and maybe evolution, what is the relationship of the people in the house to the outside world, to the society, to culture, to all that?
I'm not sure I'm following you. When you say relation, do you mean obligations, responsibilities, or?
I understand that, we're trying to grow into spiritual awareness, and it transcends being a black and white thing and goes into the transcendence of or evolution of spirit in the human evolution.
You see, beloved, as you begin to recover deeper degrees of your divine nature, what in the African Trika tradition we have called Swarupa, who you really are. In that process, your whole relationship to the world, samsara, is altered. You follow me? As you are able to recover more and more of your own true identity, it automatically changes the nature of how you interact with other people. Simply because the more you recover your sense of true self, the more you know who the other person is as well, you see? One of the things, for instance, is you move up this hierarchy of identities and make that growth. Even from a socio-cultural point of view. When you, for instance, recover your own true identity at the socio-cultural level of being an African, just because you are not in Africa does not mean you're not African. You follow me? You're African, you see. And once you recover that, then you realize so are they. And you're no longer a victim of their own, you see, personality and mental disorders that is causing them to think they're something other than African. You come into a different relationship. As you even learn your history of the fact that your ancestors have made all of these incredible sacrifices for your sake. When you discover the miraculous nature of your own African existence, now you automatically understand that the Venerable Theravadaji is also a miracle. You see? So you begin to relate to him as a miracle, which is a very different way you perhaps were relating to him prior to the recovery of your own African consciousness. But as you rightly pointed out, African consciousness is just the beginning. There's more, because we're really talking about the recovery of your divine consciousness. And that is not African, it is not European. In fact, it's not even human. You see my point? It is transcendent of all of that. Pure spirit. Now, as you move up that hierarchy, beloved, then naturally how you view and see the world and experience the world and thus relate to the world gets altered. Once, for instance, you have recovered your true identity as divine, then you begin to see the world as simply a manifestation of your own divinity and your glorious nature. The net result of such a vision is that you love. You see, beloved? You simply love everybody and everything itself, because, in fact, from where you're sitting and seeing, that's all the world is a reflection of myself. The sense of separation, ego, is overcome. There is no more two, no more duality, no more me and them. It's just me in all of my glorious forms and manifestation being reflected. That changes the whole relationship, doesn't it? Achar, now in the book of Sadhana, we will go into that. So Rani Kumari and Dhammamaji is ready to go to work. So if it takes a long time, see them, right? I'm finished with my part. All right. I have to put them on the spot like this. That's where we know we get it out here on time. Something else to say about it? You're most welcome. You see, beloved, that is why we have those kinds of disciplines that we do have in association with the sadhana of the house, the sadhana of seva and so forth and so on, is a way of starting to prepare you so that when you are able to see the difference in your relationship to others from the point of view of rendering seva, and as you begin to enjoy your relationship with others more as a result of that, then that becomes a kind of motivation to go all the way. Seva, of course, is based on the presumption of unity, isn't it? Isn't it? So all of the practice, then, that are associated with the sadhana of the way, of the God realization process, if you will, are based on the transcendence of ego. It's based on the transcendence of this false presumption that others are different from you. Because until you can overcome this presumption through hook or crook, then you simply are in no position to make any kind of spiritual progress. You just can't do it. You can read a lot of books, you can come to a lot of meetings like this, you can do all kinds of things, but you just can't. There's no foundation for it. You must have a glimpse of the oneness that is the case, and always the case. You simply must realize it. So we can say a lot about this. Something else to discuss? You're most welcome. Anything you like. Yes, beloved. So good to see you again.
Male, female. We come here in these bodies, you know. Why did I come as a female rather than a male? Why did you come as a male? What is the, how do we transcend that? And what is the transcendence of that about?
Well, you have to enjoy the distinction between being female from a spiritual point of view and being female in gender and in physiology. To simply have the physiology of what we call a woman does not necessarily mean that you are any more female than Sabakti, right? And we can clearly see.
The point I'm making, beloved, is that female is a aspect of God. And most spiritual traditions, God is conceptualized as being androgynous, right? Both male and female. And it is out of the female's Shakti, as we call it. The African ancestor called it Mut. That everything comes into being, right? Everything that comes into being out of the Shakti Mut. And are made of it. So everything is made of female energy. There is no other energy. The argument, beloved, is that the whole creation is nothing but a manifestation of the divine female force that was called Mut or called Shakti. You see? So from a spiritual perspective, you see, we are all female. You see, you have no other option because that's all it is. Because Shakti, the divine female force, and by female I mean creative. Creative. The Shakti or Mut is the creative side of God. It's that side of God out of which God creates. When God begins the process of creation, that's the female dimension of God at work here. So everything is made out of that energy that is Shakti, that is Mut. It is the mother of creation. Not only is it the mother of creation, it is creation. It is both the creator and also the objects created. There is no distinction. She is everything and everywhere. She is the world. That is what we mean when we say that God is its own creation. But that God is female. But I don't want to use that word too much because the word has been corrupted and associated with you all's gender and all that stuff. You understand? That is not to be transcended. That is to be recovered. Just the opposite. You see? What is to be transcended is your pseudo-female nature. That is to be transcended and given up so that you may recover your authentic female nature. You see? And that's a different story, isn't it? In the book of Sadhana, we will talk about it, talk much about it, because this Shakti energy, power, is essential in our recovery of our true identities. In India and in many other cultures, that is the principal form of worship, you see, of the Divine Mother. That is the principal form of worship. But it is not like the Western concept of the female, the woman. It is the representation of that creative function of the Supreme Lord and being. Something else to say about it, beloved?
Well, how can we help them to not get caught up in the morass, into this false identity? What is our way of helping them not to?
You do the best you can. Of course, you can begin by first making sure you're free from it, because our children tend to mimic, duplicate what they see in us. So you can do your best in order to demonstrate and model such freedom. But ultimately, you see, beloved, like everything else, it's about grace. Just as your own existence is about grace. You've done nothing. You see? Ultimately, have you? So everything is ultimately by grace. Dayal. Anugraha. Grace. But you do the best you can by way of demonstrating. More can be said about it. Something else you would like to discuss? Okay, Pat, my daughter has a question.
Talk about mental illness in regards to the Black community and why so many young Black adults are now killing themselves. Why have we gotten to that point where we can't survive, or we can't simply function?
In some way, your question is linked to her concerns as well. Well, when we fail to create a kind of environment that prepares our children for the realities of life, when our children
are fundamentally made into consuming machines, full of so many desires, greed, and so forth and so on. Well, it sets them up for a crisis later on. In fact, what Pal is talking about is what in the profession is called quarter life crisis. Just as there was a midlife crisis, most of you know exactly what I'm talking about, right? You get that point in your midlife where you're in crisis, you don't know what to do now. You don't know whether to stay married, get divorced, you don't know whether you want to continue to work a job or chuck it all and get your pension and open up you a corner grocery store. You don't know whether you want to stay in the same neighborhood another 30 years and die here. You get at a point in life where you become full of doubt. You become very confused. You don't know which way to go. You become disillusioned fundamentally with your prior philosophy of life and strategy for life and all of your ambitions. You become disillusioned with all of that. You see that this stuff wasn't what I thought. Now what do I do? I'm 55 years old. And you realize, of course, you're going to die, so that's some added pressure. Well, that whole experience now has shifted down to people between the ages of 25 and 30, but in that early 20-something. They are in that same crisis. They don't know what to do with their life. They have already had a sense of failure, right? And that failure is so overwhelming. Well, that is a kind of mental illness, isn't it? Or it certainly open you up to the development of a lot of mental illnesses because your whole psychology has broken down, ceased to function. What can be done, you say, to avoid that? Well, the truth of the matter is that what needs to be done is so immense that one person can't do it. That takes the whole village now. You see, now we get into village talk. You have to understand, pal, that the kind of transformation required for a person to overcome that kind of deficit is more than that individual person is capable of in the first place. And this is a usual oversight that people make when they consider spiritual transformation. They feel that, well, I can transform myself simply on the strength of my own individual effort and sadhana. That never happens. Spiritual transformation always must occur within the context of a community. It must. Because it is the community of other spiritual practitioners that bring to bear upon you the force necessary to deal with it in the form of holding you accountable and so forth and so on. But much of these forms of depression and suicidal impulse that we find in our young people in your age group, all right, most of your friends, right, feel as if their life has been a complete failure and it's all over with. And they're ready to die, literally. They've given up on life. Sure. Because they have started life with a false view of what real life is all about, isn't it? Their view of what life should be about comes straight off the television set, straight out of the magazines, and so forth and so on. Their view of life is fundamentally hype. And they find out that I can't make hype function like life. And then they don't know what else to do, because these children only know how to hype and not how to live. Not knowing really how to live and only knowing how to be a creature of hype, they're in a tremendum. They're in crisis. They don't have those sets of skills. Well, they don't have those sets of skills because the community did not develop them in you. That's fundamentally the whole thing. So it's very difficult to change an individual without first dealing with the community that individual is a part of. You have to deal with this thing at a kind of a collective level. That is why we have argued here at the House about the necessity for really implementing the principles of community that we talked about, the politics of saving, so forth and so on. All of that is designed to create a healthy community. Our child, beloved, how can you raise a child in a community that is not healthy? I mean, that simply is not going to happen because you're not raising them in a vacuum. You see? Ultimately, you have to deal with the community. It is really tragic. You see, being a therapist, being in the business, so to speak, I see this. I see it all the time, and it's really heartbreaking. Really heartbreaking. So what can I tell you, pal? Try to get hooked up into a healthy community, and start all over again, right? Something else to say about it?
It's the whole acidity of the West. You see, that whole McDonald-mindedness. Everything right now. The impulsivity, right? America, in fact, tells you shouldn't have to wait on nothing.
Right.
I mean, this is the cultural, imperative. Don't ever wait on nothing. If you can't get it right away,
move on to the next. You follow me? Well, this now just results in those victims of that kind of propaganda inability to bring the requisite degree of tolerance and patience to life, doesn't it? So what you find is that our young folks, and some of our old folks as well, suffer from tolerance deficit disorder. They simply do not have the requisite degree of tolerance and self-discipline and patience necessary to live at the real level of life. They have no stamina. Hence, they are easily discouraged. The microwave, right? The microwave is a metaphor, right? You want to pop something in there, push a button, and in 30 seconds, you want a 12-course meal. You see my point? You want an alternative to sweating over a hot stove and making the meal the only way that a 12-course dinner can be made. You can't make it microwave. So when the individual becomes full of all of this kind of impulsivity, cultural impulsivity, then naturally they're going to have a lot of disappointment because guess what? The world don't work like that, does it? The world does not respond to your impulsive desire. It doesn't work like that. Thus, they begin to have a lot of disappointment. Failed expectations. Well, what do we call the experience that happens when a person's expectations are not met on a continuous basis? What happens to them eventually, Siddhanta?
Frustration, disappointment, and all of those are euphemisms for depression. Now they become depressed. Well, depression is fundamentally the feeling that I don't have enough energy to live. That's all depression is. It's a depression of the rock.
It is a depression of chi. It is a depression, a dissipation, a diminishment of life force, right? Depression is simply the sign that you become too weak to live. You don't have enough energy to do what it takes. You follow me? You cannot handle any more failures. Well, you're going to always fail because you've set yourself up for failure on the basis of your unrealistic expectations from life and others, and even of yourself. Therefore, most of the kind of clinical depression, this depression is really going to do you in, is arising from this person's false and unrealistic expectations of themselves. Because they've been bombarded in the media with the images of these young boys and women out here who have made $50 million by the age of 21, right? And there's so much of that propaganda in the media. The feeling among young people is that, damn, if I haven't made $1 million by the time I'm 20, I'm a failure. I mean, this is really their feeling. And certainly by the time I get my degree, and within a year of that, by the age of 25, I should be rolling in dough. And of course, that doesn't happen. And so they now are confronted with the failure of their own self-expectations. And that's usually what puts them over the edge. So it's a lot of stuff here. Well, Pal, I'm making this point because as long as you are full of these false expectations, then you have no perforce but to undergo such a destiny. What is required then for young people as well as the old people suffering from the same malady is that you got to see things the way things really are. Your view has to be cleaned up. The malas, the layers of ignorance that is obscuring and covering your intellect, have to be removed. Your intellect is not functioning. Interesting. It's very seldom we talk about having a dysfunctional intellect, isn't it? I'm telling you, most often, it is because you have a dysfunctional intellect. The buddhi, as it has been called in the tradition. your buddhi, your intellectual faculty, the mechanism by which you experience knowledge, the mechanism, the faculty through which you know. That faculty itself is dysfunctioned. You see, it's impure. It's full of dirt. I used to always liken the intellect or mind to a mirror. And just as we use a mirror, we can look at ourselves and, so many other things. Well, what happens if that mirror is covered with all kinds of dirt and dust? Will you get a good reflection? No. The same is with the intellect. If your intellect is covered with a lot of ignorance, then you will be having an experience of the world based on ignorance. And what is the sign that you are experiencing the world based on ignorance? Your depression, your suffering, your unhappiness. That is a sign that you are operating with a defective intellect. Your intellect is not pure. It is still covered with a lot of ignorance. So one of the goals then of the path is to remove that ignorance, right? In fact, that is the goal of all the paths, both modern and ancient. In fact, this Buddha, which is a symbol of spiritual authority in the Akan tradition, you see, has been ceremonially used to swipe away your ignorance. It's a symbolic gesture, you know what I mean? But if only it worked, huh? But that was the whole point, you see, that was the point. We have to sweep your mind clean of all your ajana, of all your ignorance, so that your buddhi, that mechanism that enables you to know, the faculty of cognition, can accurately reflect things the way things really are. Now that automatically gives you the ability to operate your body-mind accurately in relationship to the way things really are. Hence, no more disappointment. You follow me? Because you are now able to see things clearly. We have called that vavika. You see? There's the personification of vavika, right? Vavika. And Maharaj used to always say that 90% of enlightenment is made up of vavika. There's a direct correlation between the coming into full recognition of self as God and the degree of purification of the buddhi, of the mind, and its capacity to see things the way things really are. We have called that vavika jhana, the power of intellect to know, and to know rightly. Vavika jhana. And so that is the whole purpose of satsang and books and so forth and so on. It is to deal with the removal and the wiping away from your intellectual and mental faculties all of your ignorance. The first ignorance is ignorance of yourself. As long as your buddhi is obscured and covered by the dirt and dross of ignorance, you can't even know yourself, because it is the instrument that knows. So that's the first order of business. And if you don't know yourself, I don't care what else you know, you are fundamentally ignorant. You follow me? All other knowledge is meaningless. You don't know who you are. Thus, you do not know how to live in this world. And the signs of that is your unhappiness, is your dukkha, is your misery. It doesn't matter that you might have come up with a strategy to practice self-denial and delusion to give yourself relief from the agony of your ignorance. That's just, strategy. It doesn't change the fact that you're ignorant. You follow me? We see that, don't we? I mean, we see it in our community a lot. And more so in my era and prior to me, when we didn't have as much access to education. But I remember growing up, and even nowadays we see remnants of that kind of character in our community who try to talk like they have 12 PhDs from Harvard. Have you seen them? Oh, they're so proper. But this is fundamentally an idiot. They can't add 2 plus 2. They don't know any of that stuff at all. They only can act like they're intelligent. But really, they are not intelligent. And the science of it is in their life, in their living. So it hardly matters whether we have developed coping mechanisms that enable us to deal with our fundamental ignorance. But it's just a coping mechanism. Ultimately, you got to get real knowledge. Real jhana. You see? Sudhaviya, real knowledge, pure knowledge of the way things are. And in the recovery of that jhana, you see, then all of these so-called mental illnesses drop away. Mental illnesses are there because you don't have any jhana. And depending on what kind of history you have, when I say history, not just of this world, but history as a embodied being across the entire spectrum of your many incarnations, dependent upon that, you might only be at that stage in your own spiritual evolution where you don't need, your body is still wired for ignorance, right? I mean, you may be wired for ignorance at the level of your nervous system. You might be generating ignorant-based neurotransmitters and neurons, and ignorant at the cellular level. There's no hope. For you need a new body. All right? So it depends upon a lot of things. And yet, we all notice that each of us have an individual and unique position when it comes to this. For some of us, we will have to work a lot harder to overcome our own ajna and self-ignorance than others, because our minds are more laden with false knowledge and ignorance. So we have to do more sadhana. We'll have to do more stuff. Whereas there are others who have a lesser degree of contamination of their mind by ignorance, then they don't have to do perhaps as much sadhana. They still have to do some sadhana, but perhaps not as much. So there then becomes a direct correlation between your degree of mental and emotional illness and your degree of ignorance. In therapy, that's all that the therapist does, isn't it, Siddhanta? We try to remove your ignorance. And if we can't do that, we at least give you some medication to tie you over. But that's all that is about. It is medicating you to relieve you from the agony of your ignorance. That's fundamentally the function of the pharmaceutical dimension of therapy. Even therapists understand that's not a cure. We're just trying to, keep you together until we can help you. Now, there are some who buddhi is so embedded and contaminated that you can't clean it up. Them we institutionalize and medicate forever. There's just no way to clean them up. Too much stuff. They have self-deceived and self-deluded themselves to a point of psychosis. Right? So a lot can be said about it. You begin to understand it? Now, Dayo Sahib and then Samadhi Sahib. Acha.
My question has to do with this aspect of dysfunctional intellect and recovery of self and realizing one's identity as God. To a great extent, would you agree that our very language itself, the way we talk and express ourselves, is almost structured and designed to reinforce concept of a separate self, you know. The subject, the verb, the object is all one grows up thinking, even expressing themselves, trying to communicate with others in terms of myself being the subject.
Yes.
And hence, the microwave mentality might only be an evolutionary logical progression of a language that's foundational in terms of that frame of thought.
Yeah.
But in terms of recovery of oneself, and then if using the language
Yes.
to think in the way we were taught and to deal with this
Mhm.
aspect of recovery, would that not then make, instead of the observer, the self, this I, this
Yes, yes,
conditional
yes, yes.
individuality,
Yes, yes.
make that person is no longer the subject but the object, and that which we ultimately hope
Mhm.
to identify, knowing ourselves as God,
Yes.
becomes the subject.
That's
Might one really look at the phenomena and what one observes in their experience, instead of language being an affirmation and a reinforcement of the individual self, but reverse the subject-object relationship such that one tries or attempts to think in terms of themselves as object, and maybe you break over from time to time.
I understand. You're talking about create a gap. Yeah. And in fact, there's been a lot of sadhanas that are designed to create such a gap. In fact, in the Buddhist tradition, Vipassana, just observing the thoughts, right? It requires a certain degree of ability to attend to your thoughts, you see? And everybody, of course, don't have that ability. But if you do have that capacity, by simply looking at, watching causes distance, by definition. Are you following me? And then the discovery that I am not whatever you were priorly identified with. That, in fact, beloved, is the whole rationale behind the process of sitting meditation, isn't it? For instance, the ideal is to, through disciplining of this body, and the withdrawal of attention from it sufficiently, you will automatically have the experience that I am not the body. With that comes a whole liberation from a whole way of life that was predicated on you being just this physical body. Are you following me? In fact, that's one of the first aids that we can resort to. And Prambani is going to talk about that. Samadhi is going to talk about that. Mani Sahib is going to talk about that. So definitely make sure you're at that workshop. I'm only going to be able to say just a little bit about it. You follow me? Yes, this whole business that Pal is talking about and that is relevant to all of us is all based on where you are at in the hierarchy of the sense of self. If you are fundamentally identified with your body as self, then that automatically is going to open you up to a lot of this stuff. You have no option. Because that comes with the misidentification of self with the body. But if you can withdraw your attention from the body, create that gap, that distance, you'll have the experience that I am greater than this body. Then, through that same process of withdrawal of attention, not thinking, as you rightly pointed out, language is not going to help you. Positive affirmations and positive thinking is useless here. You follow me? You must transcend all of that, mustn't you? Yeah. And that is a transcendence in attention. By simply saying, I'm not the body, I'm not the body, you do not lose the experience of being the body. So you can reverse language. That's a game. You follow me? I am saying you must transcend all of that. Because that's really what you're saying. I am not the body, I'm no longer the subject, I'm the object. But it is still speech. It is, isn't it?
Yeah.
So you haven't gone anywhere. Instead of standing straight up, you are now standing on your head. But you're going nowhere. There's no movement. You have to transcend that whole process. When you transcend the body, now you are coming to the level of your emotions, because a part of your sense of self also includes your identification with what's going on emotionally. Isn't that all right? I feel sad, I feel happy, I'm disappointed. All of that is because of our identification with a particular emotional mode that is going on, isn't it? Hmm? And so when you say, I'm angry, then you act a certain way based on the identification with the anger, right? Because if I didn't say I'm angry, then I wouldn't be cussing nobody out. The cussing somebody out comes first from my identifying myself with my anger. Are you following me? That's right, feelings. Well, as you are able to make more and more progress in meditation, you're able to now create that same distance between your emotion that you have created between your body, and you become free and come into a higher sense of self. Not only am I not just this physical body, nor am I these feelings that are going on in it, right? More practice, progress, finally leads you to the point now where you can create that same distance between your thought. Because your most ultimate form of identification is with your thinking, your thought, your opinions, your beliefs. And you really feel you are your thinking, your thought. But if you can move a little deeper, you'll find out, no, am I my thoughts. Thoughts are objects arising in consciousness. Hmm? Now, in the book of Sadhana, we're going to break all of this stuff down. And we will talk about the trinity of being. It's interesting, isn't it? The trinity of your being. Now, the truth, beloved, now looking from a higher point of view, you are not only the subject, you are also the object. And you are the medium that is experiencing it. That's the reality. Pramata, prameya, pramana. You are all three, and yet transcendent to them. You see? It is an amazing thing. That's the whole argument about the collapse of duality, isn't it? Yep. You see? As long as you're saying that I'm the subject, then that's the object. Or whether you reverse it. Well, now I'm going to be the object, and that's going to... You're still in duality. From the highest point of view, you are all of that, because there is nothing else but God. Tatsuram, all of this is God. And the African wisdom tradition of Afrika Savais, it is said in one of the tantras that Nasavam Diyati Kasit, which means that there's nothing that exists that is not Siva. Siva meaning God. Nothing that exists is not God. Profound. Isn't it? Therefore, the subject is God, the object of the subject is God, the medium through which the transaction is happening, that is also God. Nothing that exists is not God. And if you are God, then nothing that exists is not you. QED. Samadhi, something to add?
No, I was just going to make a comment about the mental illness and the microwave mentality. That it's ironic that all of this urgency to have everything now or do everything now is also coupled with the false sense of living forever. So what's the urgency of having it now if you think you're going to live forever? So the problem comes in when you realize you're not going to live forever.
Yeah. And the more that conviction is there, as it is with young people, incidentally, because most young people really don't feel they're going to live, not just forever. They don't think they're going to live for 50 years. You see my point? So forever has been compromised in their case. But in them, there's not even a feeling that I'm going to live to be 50. You see? many of them have already, as little children, already presumed that they will probably be dead before they're 35, right? So now that they go through their lives and they're getting closer to 35, can you see the urgency of it? I'm 30 years old. I finished high school and went to junior college. And I ain't succeeded. And I ain't got but 5 more years to live. That's a crisis for them. But you're absolutely right, somebody. This kind of death concept is there that fuels it, doesn't it? So, and that is another form of ignorance, isn't it? Right? So it's really, ultimately then, in the initial stages, the spiritual process is really about first removing the various layers of ignorance that we all have. So it's not just one person has it, or 2 people have it, that we all suffer from the disease of ignorance. Yes, beloved?
A friend of mine went to, I believe, Ghana.
Mm-hmm.
And he was there with some of the elders.
Acha.
And they diagnosed him with a disease. They told him he had ancestors deficiency syndrome.
I like that. We're going to borrow that from you. Is that all right? Ancestors deficiency syndrome. All right.
To my question, isn't that the root of most of our problems not being connected to those
To knowledge.
before us?
Yeah, and that's the whole point. The source of knowledge, now we're going to, just speaking sociologically now and culturally, in terms of a continuum. And one of the arguments pertaining to African in America is that we have been disconnected from an authentic African continuum. The continuum meaning that source of knowledge that people had accumulated for dealing with the vicissitudes and the issues confronting black people. Some black people, way back in our experience, have already figured out how to deal with the white man, or have already figured out everything you're dealing with that pertains to your being African, for instance, right? And more. Ancestral wisdom is not just about how to be safe and black in America. You have a very narrow understanding of the vastness of ancestral wisdom. It's talking about here's the same wisdom you need to deal with your woman and your man. You understand? Your children, right? But if you are cut off from that, disconnected from that, then you are, by definition, working from a deficit, aren't you? Hence the ancestral deficit disorder and syndrome. You are working out of limited knowledge, what we have called in the tradition Shuddhaviya, limited knowledge. Even their language and their terminology was precise. You have too limited knowledge about life to be happy. How about that? Yeah. Your knowledge base is too limited. All you've done is gone to the university and got a PhD. And you read a lot of newspapers. You need to read New York Times, you watch the Post, you watch all of the news, you know what I mean? You follow all of the magazines, you're a vociferous reader. And you thinking that that is deep knowledge. That's not deep knowledge. There is a real, authentic African deep thought. African deep thought. You see? Yes, you won't find any author of it. That deep thought and the wisdom associated with it preceded in time literacy and writing, and has been couched in the form of proverbs and the sayings. So you find them in all of the cultures, whether it's Akan or Achan, it doesn't matter. Embedded in that is some deep wisdom, isn't it? So a lot of the connection then to the ancestors is maintained in the form of always knowing and remembering their sayings that has come down. You see? Now most of us don't know what none of that is at all. Very little of it. You see, our philosophy of life is made up of the proverbs underlying American wisdom. You see what I mean?
proverbs like, get as much as you can get. Be number one. You know what I mean? The American gender of Proverbs, right? You see? Go for it. Never say no. Always win. You see my point? Never be satisfied. Always do more. Those are the Proverbs that underlie and inform and shape your worldview, right? Because your worldview is made up of these Proverbs, right? You may read a few books, but those too are nothing but commentaries on the Western silly, aren't they? Is it anything else? Anything else? Nothing. All right? Even your African authors and philosophers that you are reading, most of them is simply giving you comments on Western philosophy, which is still not African. Just because an African person wrote something on Freudian psychology, that ain't African psychology. It's Freudian psychology being further validated by a person that is black. That's all that's about, isn't it? And it is the same with the black theologian who is writing on Christianity. That still has nothing to do with African theology at all. It's Western. So you begin to have to look behind this. But you're absolutely right. Cut off from that uninterrupted flow of wisdom. Disconnected from that ancestral wisdom. Wisdom that stretches back to before the first time. As the African calls it, Zeptepi, before the first time, right? That wisdom was there operating. Cut off from that. Now, you're trying to transact something as complex and immense as life with limited knowledge, almost no knowledge. Is there any other possibility other than your failure? Any?
Ability that someone developed to listen to, communicate with ancestors right now, or even ancestors into their body.
You see, to be able to intuit the ancestral knowledge.
Again, that depends on the degree of operation and functionality of your intellect, right? Your faculties by which you have knowledge. You see, if your faculty and apparatus by which you have knowledge, your buddhi, your mind, is relatively operating at a high level, then you are able to intuitively, you see, pick it up. But what is the case with those who buddhi in mind is not so functional? Then what has always been the case is that at every time and in every culture, in every place, there have always been those extraordinary individuals who act as a foci of the throughput of that knowledge. They have been called gurus or sebas or whatever you want to call them, but fundamentally, what has really occurred in them is a space is made, right? They've hooked up, so to speak, and they become the primary source of that knowledge. They become the sages. And in certainly in African cultures we have them, and in Indian culture we have them. And I suppose even we have some gurus here, but they're all on Wall Street, I understand. We have, right? So I guess we're catching up in our culture. But you certainly first have to realize that you suffer from ignorance, and that's the hardest part of the process of becoming transformed, is to acknowledge I am fundamentally ignorant. That's hard. You see? But that is what must be seen. You must at least have that much of a vivek to see that you are ignorant. That much viveka you should have. That shouldn't even be that hard to do. Maharaji said if you need a little aid to help you see that, simply set your life in the palm of your hand and look at it. And see, have you lived a life that is based on wisdom or ignorance? Are you living a life based on wisdom now, or is it still just ignorance? You see my point? And if you can look honestly and openly at it, you will find, yes, I am ignorant. You see, it doesn't make you a bad, worthless human being. It just, you're ignorant. You see. Ptahhotep said that you were born ignorant, therefore the need for a savior. Clear. Clear. Yes, beloved.
The African concept of polygamy, the purpose of it,
The what?
the concept of polygamy.
Polygamy. Oh, we practice that. We have a form of polygamy going on here in America, don't we?
But I mean,
Well, I understand. I understand. I don't even know if polygamy has a spiritual purpose. I think polygamy is
More or less a response to social realities. Of course, we can say that there might be something compassionate about it in the sense that a woman is not left to struggle on her own to raise her family and is brought in by another man. Very often in ancient polygamy, it would be that man's brother. And even in some of the remnants of the practice, you can still see that flavor, right? Where the brother would naturally assume the responsibility of his brother's family if something should unfortunately happen to his brother, and so forth and so on. Even if that means taking his wife in and raising his children and so forth and so on. So we can see something like that. And even in India, there was a reversal of it, where you had women that had multiple husbands and so forth and so on. So yes, at some level I can see its utility. But polygamy per se simply has nothing to do with becoming more spiritual. You know what I mean? It is a practical solution to a community problem, you see. And you have to remember in those times, you know, there was no agencies, there was no other place that such people could go. If the community did not take care of you, you perished. Or if that brother did not take care of you, the person perished. Today, of course, we have all kinds of things here, you see, to deal with those same eventuality, because women are still being, you know, left widows, right? They've come up with different ways of dealing with that. That's the way they dealt with it then. But over time, you see, it can just simply become a way of masking. You see my point? Just man's own particular desire to create status. You see, even in some of the traditional cultures in Africa, it's just a symbol of status. You know what I mean? It has nothing to do with rescuing nobody. It has nothing to do with love. It's status. You know, I'm a king, and I'm a bigger king because I got 40 wives than you. You only got 12. Bigger king. You know what I mean? It becomes ego-enhancing. But it has nothing to do with authentic spiritual growth. I wish that would be the case, because some of these players out here would be Buddha, man. You know what I'm talking about? I mean, if you're a player and you can get you enough women, voila. But it has very little to do with it. But it does have value. That's the point I'm making. You see, it has value. It made sense. And even in some parts of the world, it still makes sense, doesn't it? Sure, because they still have those same kinds of problems, so forth and so on. Is there anything else you would like to discuss? Yes, beloved.
Read and heard that all spirits or all souls want to possess a body.
Acha.
And those of us who have bodies, and the purpose of the body, that only spiritual growth can only take place when you have a physical body. Now, I don't know if that's true.
Acha.
And those of us who have bodies, it seems, looking at us in terms of how we operate, we get caught up in how our body looks instead of understanding it's used for spiritual development.
Acha.
So could you speak to
Yeah,
this?
so I'll say it. And the book that will be on Sadhana, we will go into that too. Because
these are real things that one has to understand. Well, first of all, you have to understand, beloved, that there are different categories of beings, obviously. There are beings with bodies, beings without bodies. Now, what is it that makes the human body, or any body for that purpose, but definitely the human body as opposed to the animal body, useful, is that in this body you can act. You can't act without a body, right? At all. So you can't do anything. If you can't do anything, you have no control over your outcome. You can't move. For instance, there are disembodied and unembodied, and there's a distinction between the two. The disembodied are those who had bodies but no longer have them. They dropped away. And then there are beings who simply never had a body, period. These are what has been called in the African tradition of Afrika, Shavaism, they were called devatas, divine beings. In the tradition of our ancient African creators of the Cheta, they were called the Neteru. You're familiar with that, right? The celestial beings, right? Horus and Isis and all of that, you know? The Ennead, if you will. Beings like that, they're celestial beings. They never had a body. And they thus have no ability to do anything. They live only and strictly according to the will of God. They don't have any other option. You see my point? They're completely at his mercy for their growth. They may remain at the level of a presiding deity of a region for countless. They can't decide, I want to go higher than being a presiding deity, because they have no body. They have no apparatus through which they can make karma. It gets very deep. The ability to make karma is necessary. Action. You must be able to act. You must be able to have the experience of free will. And you can't have that experience of free will except in this body. Right? This body then is God's unique mechanism by which he can reactivate his will and recover his full identity. It's an amazing argument. I can't go into it today because it requires that you have some fundamental understanding. So I will defer you to the book so that you can read systematically. You have to understand more about the metaphysics of creation. When we say creation, what are you talking about? You think we're just talking about what's in this physical world? You think that is the sum total of creation? You see? This is a small matter, isn't it? At the workshop, Samadhi and Bhamani and Prembani will talk to you some about the metaphysics of it all, divine metaphysics. You have to understand. And so from the top to the bottom, there's all kinds of beings. There are beings who literally are still having the experience of being God. There are beings who are still so close in the unfolding of the universe. They're still so close to that original point that they're still having the experience of being God, even though God had already sped them out. It's amazing. They don't even know that they're not God. They're still having their experience because they're so close. Then there are those way, way, way down here. Right? So far removed that they're having the experience of not being God. And with no possibility for it. That there's no such thing. I'm God? What kind of nonsense are you talking? That's blasphemous to them. So you have these two extremes of beings. Then, of course, you have beings that are beneath that level of the human being, don't you? Animals and so forth, who are also not having the experience of free will. They are governed by a kind of instinct, right, that govern that species, right? Dog nature is not dictated by the individual dog. It's dog nature, and it's universal through all dogs, without variation of species. So you're beginning to understand then that having this human body this temple, as it is called. It is interesting that the temple of Karnak reflects this body. Have you ever really studied something about those ancient edifices, the temples at Edfu and so forth and so on? They're constructed like this body. Even in Dogon culture, the way they lay out their whole community, it reflects this body. In India, in fact, they have called it the Nanaranjan Devi, the temple of God, you see? Because it is understood that without this body and its ability to do karma, there's no way. You see? You wouldn't even have the feeling that I'm going to get on the path. You wouldn't even have that. You couldn't even, you know what I mean? None of that would be there. So you need this body. You need this body in order to really recover your full identification as God. Now, it is interesting. I wish we had the time, because there is a category of enlightened being. We have called them the Jivamuktis. These are extraordinary individuals who have been able to recover their identity as God while still in the body. Hence, liberated beings while in the body. It's an amazing thing. Such is the value of the human body. So when you get a chance, beloved, I think you should read that, and then we can really, and I hope that we will have an occasion somewhere in the future where we all can really sit down. Now we can really get going into deep African thought. You see, we haven't scratched the surface yet. You follow me? We've been having deep Western thought. Right? But we're going to get into some African deep thought here now, because the stuff is profound and it is deep. That ancestral wisdom, beloved, it is profound. You see? The Buddha called it grahata, right? Deep. Deep, he says. This Dharma, this wisdom that I have, you see, one, is deep, profound, only knowable to the wise. That's the first thing. If you don't have requisite degrees of Viveka, you can't even understand the Dharma. The Dharma will make no sense to you. And Siddhanta was asking about the spiritual way of life. It would make no sense to such a person. Spiritual way of life? What are you talking about? You see? No Viveka. You see? For them, that life makes sense only from the American point of view. How much money I can make, how much food I can eat, how much sex I can have, how much, you understand? And they cannot even conceive. What are you talking about? I mean, it doesn't make sense. It really doesn't make sense to them. They have no Viveka. They're ignorant. They're fundamentally ignorant. So the Buddha said that this grabha, this deep wisdom, is only available to the wise. But haven't the ancestors said as much? Haven't they? Right? So even this ancestral wisdom is not available to everybody. That's why everybody is not having the experience of it. And you can pour libations to the end of time. You understand? That's a ritual. It's a ceremony. That is not how you invoke them. You see my point? That wisdom simply cannot take its seat in your intellect if your intellect is full of ignorance. If your mind is impure and full of all kinds of wrong views and wrong knowledge, it can't sit itself inside of you. How could it? You wouldn't receive it at all. You will reject it. Yes, beloved?
I want to go back to the whole notion of concept of midlife crisis. You mentioned a quarter life crisis. I don't remember that I might have had that, but I know I'm having this.
because I hear so many people, there's been a lot written about it, there's so many people that talk about it,
Mhm.
and they're sort of saying the same kinds of things in terms of their feelings.
Yes. Well, it is
And
definitely,
how do you get through it?
it's definitely a Western phenomenon,
Oh, okay.
you know, because of the way we are put together as a society, so forth and so on. Which do you wish to talk a little bit more about, the quarter life or the midlife?
Well, I'm past quarter life.
All right. Well, you see, beloved,
Over the course of time, if you are just averagely intelligent, I mean, even in spite of being covered by layers and layers of self-ignorance of your divinity and so forth and so on, there is a kind of intelligence that just is conferred by virtue of living, right? And if you have lived life with any modicum of awareness, you eventually reach a point where you exhaust your ability to lie to yourself. That's the first thing that happens. You exhaust your ability to deceive yourself. You can no longer, therefore, remain at the level of charlatan. You see? Now, most of us are charlatans. You see? You are pretending to be satisfied and happy and know what you're doing and all that other stuff. You are a charlatan. You are faking it, right? And you are able to do that because you still have the ability to deceive yourself. But at some point, just the gravity of looking back out at the outcome of your life undermines and utterly destroys that capacity in you now. Now, you suddenly have ran out of the next lie. You can't tell yourself another lie. You want to tell yourself another lie. You're trying to come up with more. You consulting books, see what kind of new lie can I find. You're trying to come up with a new variety of lie. You see, but they don't work no more. And now you realize that I have not made my life count for anything, technically. You see? That my life has no meaning, no purpose. You have not found out the answer to any of the perennial questions. Most of us, you see, we live so much of our life without even trying to find any answers to any perennial question. Who cares about a damn perennial question? You see, at 25, right? I'm not worried about is there a God, and if so, what is its nature? I'm not worried about death and is there life. I mean, you ain't worried about none of that kind of stuff, right? But at some point in your life, especially as you grow older, and your ability to remain in denial about your eventual death begins to erode, doesn't it? Because why? This body start hurting, right? Back start hurting. Doctor diagnosed you got a little cancer down in that prostrate. You know what I mean? I mean, the writing becomes clear. You look in the mirror, the hair's turning gray, the teeth are falling out. You can't remain in denial. Life brings you out of that. And it says, you die. Of course, you were dying from day one. But now it becomes clear to you, you're dying. You're going to die. And with this realization that you're going to die and your inability to lie, crisis occurs. I'm going to die and I can't lie. You're in trouble. You see my point? You're in trouble now. And you don't have enough time to go back and start over, although some will. Very often what happened in midlife crisis, beloved, I'm going to go back to school. It's too late. You're 65 years old. You don't have no career left. There is no career time for you left. Well, I'm going to go get married too late because it's your age. You won't even see your kid graduate from kindergarten. You don't have enough time left to enjoy your children. It's all gone, squandered on bullshit. And see, that's the realization. Not only that I'm out of time and you can't lie, It's the realization I have wasted my whole life on bullshit. Pure bullshit, impressing people. Trying to appear. I've been a charlatan. I've been a fake, trying to come off. And that hurts now. Because where are all those people that you spent your whole life trying to impress? Where are they at now? Did you get any awards? What do you got out of that? Nothing but emptiness. You will find out in every area of your life. It's like a Bardot, isn't it? The midlife crisis is just like a Bardot. For those of you who don't know what a Bardot is a point that, of death and dying that occurs where you sort of kind of have a review of your life. In midlife crisis, that's what's going on. You wake up one morning, you look at that man laying next to you or that woman, you realize, I never loved them. You know, and they never loved me. It was a game we playing here. And something in you said, well, I'm going to die. And do I want to play this no more? You see my point? So you can go two directions at the crisis. Break down or break through. But crisis is always necessary. So in that sense, our young people have an advantage by having quarter-life crisis if they can break through, right? Connect with that ancestral wisdom that brother was talking about, they'll take off. At our age, at 55, 60 years old, you have crisis and you break down, you out of the picture. There is no other hope for you see. Or you go in that job that day and you just decided, I can't work another minute here. You go in and you quit. All right? You go in and you quit. And you hated this job for 30 years. You worked it because you were trying to pay your mortgage and send your kids to college and so forth. But after 30 years, the outcome has been such that you're going to spend all this money on this house and, you know what I mean? You can't even enjoy it. You see my point? You lost it in the divorce settlement, something. Or the kids turned out to be just absolute failures, messed up. You know what I mean? You done did all of this and so went through all this. Or do you understand? You realize your good intentions is the term that I've used for it. All of them come home to root, don't they? All your good intentions and all the energy that you put into that now are revealed to have been counterproductive, and they fail. And there's a lot of anger about it. You see my point? Or you would turn to religion. You see? You almost always notice that the older people get, the more religious they get. When they were 25, you couldn't tell them nothing about Jesus. They didn't even want to hear nothing about Jesus. Go to church, who you kidding? You understand? But then as they get a little older and have more of that experience of real life, now it's 65 years old, they're running to church to get saved, but it's too late. It's too late. For some. You see my point? In a nick of time for others. So it depends. So each of us then, if we live long enough, are going to really come to this crossroad, aren't we, beloved? And it is a difficult time. There's two periods that are really difficult in the developmental stage of human beings, adolescence and coming into this crisis, this midlife. And of the two, I don't know which one is the most difficult. You know, I mean, they're neck to neck. In the adolescence, you're trying to make identity. In the crisis, you're trying to undo it. And they're very different. Yes, you're really trying to undo what you have made yourself. I don't want to be no husband no damn more. I don't want to be no wife no more. I don't want to be responsible. I want to get me a red Jaguar. You understand? I don't want no old Volkswagen. I mean, you're trying to undo all of that project that you just spent 30 years building, right? And that's hard. That's traumatic. It is stressful, right? It is a confusing time. Because as you're undoing all of that, you know you don't know what you're going to become. And you know, I ain't got long. So I got to come up with a whole new way of being at 65. Man, that's some scary stuff. So midlife crisis, you see, beloved, is like that. But then there's spiritual crisis. And that can happen at any age, whether young or old. And spiritual crisis is very different, you see, than either quarter life or midlife crisis. It's unlike any other crisis. And we've talked about that in the past and so forth and so on. In fact, the little story on the wisdom of the sand speaks to the spiritual crisis, doesn't it? If you're lucky, you see, you will have spiritual crisis. Everybody's not fortunate enough to have spiritual crisis. Because one of the things that is prerequisite for spiritual crisis is a relatively high degree of avika. Those whose level of avika is low simply don't have any spiritual crisis. They don't have enough avika, first of all, for it. They are too unconscious. Spiritual crisis requires some degree of awareness. But if you're lucky, you'll have spiritual crisis. That's the blessing. In Bhagavad Gita, Lord Krishna talks about those whom he loves, you see. Really loves. He sends them these kinds of crises, you know, poverty and all of those kinds of things. Real crisis. And so I've asked you all to consider it on a personal level. How will you make your life count? How will you make your life count? Really? What are you doing, really, truly now here, that will make your life count? If you're just paying your mortgage, that don't count for anything. Not really. In the scheme of things, what is that about? How will you make your life count? Most of us, after you're dead 50 years, won't nobody even know you here. Because you didn't make your life count. In African traditional wisdom tradition, we talk about becoming an ancestor, don't we, beloved? But you become an ancestor because everybody that died does not become an ancestor. You are presuming, you are flattering yourself that you will become an ancestor one day. That is not so for the vast majority of you. You will not become an ancestor. Yes, you will die, but you won't become an ancestor because nobody will remember you, because you didn't make your life count for nothing. Your life didn't count for nothing. You didn't make it count in nobody else's life, period. You didn't love nobody. You didn't enlighten nobody. You didn't do nothing for nobody. You spent your whole life on your selfish self. And therefore, your life did not count. When you did, in 25 years, the only record of you would be in the morgue somewhere. Otherwise, it would be as if you never even existed on the planet. You touched nobody's life. You did nothing. Your life did not count. And after your children did, for sure, it ain't going to count. Because then won't nobody even remember you. That's the key, isn't it? Who will remember you? Who will remember you? Interesting, isn't it? The ancient old folks used to talk about living your life in such a way that you are always remembered. In the hymns of Aman and all of the various hymns that you'll find in the literature, or what literature has come down out of the Cheto and so forth and so on, and you see these beautiful litanies, don't you, where they're talking, and one of them is about, this guy's talking about who he is. I am the noble man. I don't know if you all have read that particular hymn. It's a beautiful hymn. But the nobleman talks about how he made his life count. You see, he says, you know, I fed the hungry, I clothed the naked. You understand? I am the noble one. I did this, I did that. You see, I took in the widow. I am the noble one. I made sure that the children didn't go hungry and so forth and so on. I am that noble one. And as he ends his litany, all right, of the great doings of Ma'at throughout his life. He says, and I am that noble one whose name will be in the mouth of people for 10,000 years. He's an ancestor. Nobody's going to be calling Dio Sobbing. 5 years after you did, the name will go out of you. Or Bhagwan. You understand? I mean, we mustn't flatter ourselves here. Unless you make your life count. And the question is, how will you make your life count? No fooling, no kidding. How will you make it count? If you haven't answered that question, then you're really not living with any purpose, are you? Yes, beloved?
About hearers and seers and people who are supposed to go into a path. And he said, how will you make your utterances heard?
I love that.
And he meant like how will it be sounded over and over and over again, almost like a mantra.
Yes, yes, yes. Beautiful. Yeah. How will you make these utterance of your name? You see? Because in Kemetic mysticism, the name is a part of your being, the Rin. Kunsa's made the Rin book. A lot of you won't see it unless you initiate it, but she's made a beautiful book. We call it the Rin book, and compile all the big names that we have. But the Rin was
also considered a part of your actual being. Right? And that it lives after this body. That's why the name was put into a cartouche. It had its own sarcophagus, didn't it? To be preserved through time. The Rin. Something of you will live as long as your name is still alive. You see? In the hearts and minds of folks. Because you made a difference. See, that's a very different vibe, isn't it? It's the reverse of the Western Assyrian vibe, isn't it? Because ordinarily you ain't trying to make your life count at all. You're trying to enjoy yourself. Notice the distinction. All your energy is on, you're trying to enjoy yourself. You see, you're trying to fulfill your own desires, ambitions. You understand? That's not making your life count. That's just being self-possessed. That's all that's about. You're trying to be successful. As if that has anything to do with making your life count. You see? That is the Western concept of making your life count. I'll become very successful, famous. As if that counts. How many people have, quote-unquote, been successful? We don't even know their names. Didn't count. Didn't count for nothing. So that's what it is about, beloveds. We come here because we're trying to make our life count. That's what this is all about. It's not about anything else. Or it shouldn't be about anything else. Let me put it like that. All right, I think we had enough for today. That should go. We will have prasad, and you can just come by and so forth and so on.
Out on the back, put it in the stuff on this side,
And then after prasad, would you all remain seated if there's any announcement that needs to be made? Where are you, Badra? Do you have any announcements? Do you have any announcements for today?
Yeah.
So would you remain seated until Badraji makes her announcement after the prasad?